The sun was beginning its slow descent over the quiet suburban street, casting long, dappled shadows across the neatly manicured lawns. The kind of street where every house looked like a page from a magazine, pristine and well-kept, with flower, beds trimmed to perfection, and porches adorned with rocking chairs. It was a community that thrived on the idea of maintaining a certain order, where everyone knew their neighbors by name and exchanged pleasantries every morning as they left for work. People took pride in their homes, in the appearances they presented, and in the respect they commanded within their little corners of the world. My family and I had moved into this peaceful neighborhood only a few months ago, seeking a fresh start, a place where we could begin to heal and build our future. I had been on the job for many years now, senior county sheriff, and despite the high demands and pressures of the position, it had been my priority to ensure my family was well taken care of. My daughter, Lily, had been born with cerebral palsy, and from the moment she came into this world, my life had taken on a new meaning. She was my world. Every action I took, every decision I made revolved around her needs. She was my responsibility, and I was her protector. It wasn't easy. It never had been. But Lily, despite her condition, was an extraordinary young girl. Her spirit, despite the challenges she faced, was unwavering. She would never let anything, any physical barrier, any challenge, define who she was or what she could do. That afternoon, I was inside preparing dinner, the smells of garlic and fresh vegetables filling the air as the sound of sizzling oil echoed from the stove. It was a quiet, typical evening, and Lily was sitting outside on the porch playing with her toys. I'd set up a small area for her, with a few colorful cushions and a wooden table filled with her favorite dolls and action figures. I could hear her laughter, the sweet sound of her joy that made everything else seem insignificant in comparison. As I stood at the stove, stirring the contents of the pan, I heard a sudden, sharp knock at the door. It was a sound I had grown used to over the years, the knock that meant someone needed something, or someone was going to ask something of me. But this knock was different. It was urgent, a little too firm, and it sent a chill down my spine. I wiped my hands on a towel and with a quiet sigh, walked toward the door. When I opened it, I was greeted by a woman standing on the other side. She was tall and commanding, with her dark brown hair tightly pulled back into a severe bun. Her face was tight, with sharp, angular features that conveyed a no-nonsense attitude. She wore a crisp, navy blue blazer, the kind of outfit that gave off an air of authority. But it wasn't the outfit that set me on edge. It was the judgment in her eyes. "I'm Karen," she said, her tone clipped and businesslike. "Karen from the HOA." She didn't wait for me to speak before continuing, her words spilling out as if rehearsed. "I've received complaints about your yard. It's not up to the standards we require in this community." She glanced around the property, her eyes scanning every inch as if looking for something to criticize, something to use against me. I felt my body stiffen as I processed her words. The HOA. I had heard of them. They were the self-appointed enforcers of neighborhood decorum. A group of individuals who held sway over how homes looked, how lawns were kept, and how the neighborhood presented itself. Their standards were often unreasonable and their power was nearly absolute. But I didn't expect an issue so soon. Our yard was modest, yes, but it was clean and functional. I was about to respond when something caught my eye. Lily was sitting on the porch, as usual, smiling as she played with her toys. But as I watched, I noticed Karen's gaze fall upon my daughter. Her eyes, once sharp and stern, softened as she looked at Lily, then narrowed with disdain. I could feel the tension in the air shift as Karen stepped forward, her gaze locking onto the wheelchair that Lily sat in. I could see the judgment in her eyes, the unspoken thoughts that ran through her mind. She didn't say anything at first, but I could see the discomfort on her face, the way she avoided making direct eye contact with my daughter. "That's a hazard," Karen muttered, her voice barely audible as she took a step closer to the porch. Her words, though quiet, were filled with accusation, as though Lily's presence was somehow a problem for her. She stepped forward again, moving dangerously close to my daughter, ignoring her obvious discomfort. I watched, my heart sinking, as Karen's foot caught on a broken fence post just next to the porch steps. The moment was too quick. Karen, stumbling slightly, reached into her bag and pulled out a hammer and a handful of nails. She looked down at the broken fence post, then back at me with a cold, disinterested expression. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice rising with confusion and concern. My gaze flicked from Karen to Lily, who was now looking up at the woman with wide, unsure eyes. Without a word, Karen ignored my question, continuing to move toward the damaged fence. My instincts kicked in. I moved toward Lily, but it was too late. Karen had already begun swinging the hammer toward the loose fence board, her movements quick and deliberate. The swing was off-center. The hammer, instead of hitting wood, slipped. The nail embedded itself deep into the flesh of Lily's hand. The sound of metal piercing skin was followed by a sharp, agonizing scream from Lily that made my blood run cold. I rushed forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I scooped Lily into my arms, my hands shaking as I assessed the injury. Blood trickled from her hand, staining the porch beneath her, but it wasn't just the physical wound that tore at my heart. It was the shock in her eyes, the confusion. She couldn't understand why this was happening, why a complete stranger had hurt her so. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her eyes wide with surprise. Her hammer dangled loosely from her hand as if she hadn't fully realized the consequences of her actions. There was no apology, no remorse. Instead, she stared, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief, as though she couldn't comprehend what had just occurred. "That's it!" I shouted, my voice rising, not in anger, but in something colder, something more dangerous. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Karen blinked, startled by the sudden intensity of my voice. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, she seemed to realize the weight of the situation. I calmly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my badge, holding it up in front of her. "I'm the senior county sheriff," I said, my tone, even and deliberate, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded on my porch. For a long moment, Karen didn't say anything. She simply stared at the badge, then at me. The reality of the situation was starting to settle in for her. She had just assaulted the wrong person, someone who had the resources to make her pay. But I wasn't done yet. I wasn't going to let this go. Not while my daughter was in pain. Not while this woman stood there without a shred of empathy. No, this was only the beginning. As I cradled Lily in my arms, I made a silent vow to myself. Karen was going to regret this. The sun had barely risen the next morning when I heard the soft rustle of sheets behind me. It was Lily, awake as usual, though the traces of the previous day's pain were still visible in her eyes. I had spent most of the night sitting beside her, trying to comfort her, my mind racing through the events of the day before. The memory of Karen's face, the shock in her eyes when she realized who I was, still lingered in my mind. But more than that, what haunted me was the sight of my daughter's injured hand, the blood, the shock, and most of all, the vulnerability in her gaze. This wasn't just about the injury anymore, it was about justice. It was about making sure that no one, not even someone like Karen, could hurt my family and walk away without consequence. Lily was quiet, playing with the stuffed bear that had always been her constant companion. Her hand, bandaged tightly, rested on her lap, but she smiled as she patted the bear's head. It was a small sign of resilience, the kind that only Lily could manage, and it gave me the strength to move forward. She was stronger than anyone gave her credit for. It was time for me to be just as strong. I made my way downstairs, grabbing my phone and immediately dialing the local police department. I wasn't just any parent, I was the senior county sheriff, and I wasn't about to let someone like Karen get away with what she'd done. This wasn't an ordinary assault. It wasn't some petty argument that escalated into violence. No. Karen had intentionally hurt my daughter, and she needed to pay for it. I wasn't just speaking as a concerned father. This was personal. I wasn't going to rest until Karen faced the consequences of her actions. The phone rang a few times before the dispatcher answered. "Sheriff's Department, how can I help you?" "I need you to send someone over immediately," I said, my voice steady but laced with urgency. "We've got a serious situation. A woman from the HOA assaulted my daughter. She struck her with a hammer. I need officers here, and I need them now." The dispatcher hesitated for a moment, perhaps surprised by the tone in my voice. "Of course, Sheriff. We'll have someone there right away. Are you all right? Is your daughter—" "She's stable," I interrupted, trying to keep my composure. "Just get here. It's important." Less than 20 minutes later, 2 officers arrived at my home. I opened the door and led them inside, walking them through the events of the previous day. They took their time, asking questions, looking around the house. I explained how Karen had come onto our property, acting as though she had the authority to do whatever she pleased. I described the hammer, the nails, and the moment she had struck Lily. "Karen came to our door uninvited and hostile," I said, my voice unwavering. "She attacked my daughter with a hammer, and I had to stop her." The officers were quiet, as they listened, taking notes. I could tell that they were still processing the gravity of what I was saying. To them, it might have seemed like an isolated incident, just another case of an angry neighbor. But to me, it was so much more than that. One of the officers, a younger man with a neatly pressed uniform, glanced up from his notebook. "So you're telling me that this woman attacked your daughter with a hammer?" His voice was skeptical, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. I nodded, my jaw tightening. "Yes, that's exactly what happened, and if you don't believe me, we have video footage." I led them to the living room, where I opened the security footage from the previous afternoon. The video was clear, the timestamp visible in the corner of the screen. Karen's figure appeared on the porch, her movements fast and assertive. She strode toward the broken fence, her face tight with purpose. I could see the exact moment her foot caught on the post, causing her to stumble slightly before she pulled out the hammer. The officers watched in silence as Karen struck the fence with force. Then, in the next frame, the hammer slipped, striking Lily's hand. The sound of the blow was sickening, a sharp thud followed by Lily's cry of pain. "That's when I intervened," I said, rewinding the video to show the moment I rushed forward, scooping Lily up and away from the scene. I could feel the rage bubbling up again as I watched my daughter suffer, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was not the time for anger. It was the time for justice. The officers were silent as the video ended. The younger officer looked at his partner, his face pale. This is pretty serious," he said softly. I nodded. "I need you to do your job. Get her arrested, charge her with assault. I want this to go through the proper channels." The officers assured me they would begin their investigation right away. "We'll need to take statements from all involved," the older officer said. "And we'll need to speak with your daughter as well. I understand she's the victim, but we'll need to make sure we have all the details." I agreed, though I was hesitant. I didn't want Lily reliving the trauma of the event, but I knew it had to be done. I arranged for a separate room in the house where Lily could speak with the officer. I sat nearby, watching as she calmly explained what had happened, her small voice steady despite the pain she had endured. Once the officers left, I took a moment to process everything. The reality of what was happening began to settle in. Karen was going to face consequences. She would not get away with this. I wasn't going to let her. The investigation quickly took on a life of its own. While the officers worked on gathering evidence and building their case, I began digging into Karen's past. It wasn't hard to find information about her. As a sheriff, I had resources at my disposal that most people didn't. I could access public records, look through previous complaints, and talk to people who had crossed paths with Karen in the past. It didn't take long to find troubling patterns in Karen's history. She had a long record of using her position in the HOA to manipulate and control the neighborhood. Her complaints were infamous, often petty and vindictive, targeting anyone who didn't adhere to her rigid standards. She had filed numerous complaints about people's lawns, fences, and even the colors of their homes. The HOA, a group of people who had been given far too much power over the residents, seemed to bow to her demands without question. People were afraid of her influence, her ability to make their lives difficult. I spoke to a few neighbors who had been on the receiving end of her complaints. One woman, who had lived on the street for years, told me about how Karen had tried to force her to cut down a tree in her yard because it blocked the view from Karen's window. Another man shared a story about how Karen had threatened to report him for a minor infraction just to get him to remove his camper from his own driveway. It became clear to me that Karen was more than just a misguided HOA member. She was a bully, a woman who used her position to impose her will on others. She had hurt people before, but this time, she had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. As the days passed, I continued to gather evidence. I spoke to more neighbors, collected more statements, and pulled more records. Karen had a history of being a tyrant, but this time, I would make sure the law caught up with her. But Karen, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing, continued to live her life as if nothing had happened. She didn't know that I was already investigating her, that I was gathering the tools to bring her down. She didn't realize that she was dealing with someone who not only had the power to stop her, but the determination to make sure she faced the consequences of her actions. This was far from over. It had just begun. The courtroom was heavy with the kind of tension that settles into the bones, a silence that spoke volumes. The walls, painted in a pale, sterile white, stood as mute witnesses to the events about to unfold. The low hum of conversations and the shuffle of papers could barely be heard over the weight of anticipation that filled the room. I sat in my seat, my hands clasped tightly together, staring straight ahead. My mind was laser-focused, though. My heart was thumping in my chest, the nerves palpable despite the professionalism I had cultivated over the years in my line of work. This was it, the day I had been waiting for. The day I would see justice for my daughter, the day I would ensure that the woman who had harmed her would finally face the consequences of her actions. Karen walked into the courtroom with a sense of arrogance, her posture stiff and controlled, as if she were the one in control of the situation. She wore a dark, tailored suit that seemed out of place in the otherwise neutral setting of the courtroom, a stark contrast to the innocence of my daughters. Suffering. Her confident stride did nothing to hide the anger in her eyes, nor the bitterness that had come to define her over the years. Karen had always thought she could control everything around her, her neighborhood, the HOA, the lives of those who didn't conform to her standards. But today, she was going to learn just how wrong she had been. I had been through my fair share of investigations and trials, but this one was different. This one was personal. This time, it wasn't about an anonymous victim or a case that could be written off as a number. This time, the victim was my daughter, and I would move heaven and earth to ensure her attacker would be held accountable. The judge called the case to order, his voice steady and authoritative, cutting through the murmur of the courtroom. I rose from my seat and walked toward the witness stand, each step a testament to the unwavering determination that had fueled me since the day Karen had injured Lily. The prosecutor, a young woman with sharp eyes and a quiet strength, gave me a brief nod before I took my place at the stand. The judge, an older man with graying hair and glasses perched at the end of his nose, gave me a polite nod before motioning for me to begin. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," he said. "I'm Senior County Sheriff Nathan Harris," I replied, my voice clear and unwavering. I'm here today to recount the events that occurred on the afternoon of date, when Karen, last name, a member of the Homeowners Association, physically assaulted my daughter, Lily Harris. I could feel Karen's eyes boring into me from across the courtroom, but I refused to acknowledge her gaze. My focus was on one thing, making sure the truth was heard. I could see her hands gripping the arms of her chair, her fingers turning white with the pressure. She was a woman used to controlling situations, but today, the situation was out of her hands. I'll start by explaining the events leading up to the incident, I began, my voice steady. On the day in question, Karen came to our home, uninvited. She identified herself as a representative of the HOA and made a series of complaints about the condition of our yard. This was not the first time she had approached us with such grievances, but it was the first time it escalated to violence. I paused, my eyes briefly flicking toward Lily, who sat quietly in the back of the courtroom. She was my anchor, the reason I was standing here today. She was the one who needed me to be strong, and I would not let her down. Karen, I continued, moved toward our porch, where my daughter was playing. She made a comment about my daughter's wheelchair and referred to it as a hazard. Then, without warning, she took a hammer from her bag and began swinging it at the loose fence post. I could see Karen's face tightening as I spoke, but I was resolute. When she swung the hammer, it missed the post and struck my daughter's hand. The injury was severe. Lily screamed in pain, and I immediately intervened, pulling her away from the scene. I glanced at the prosecutor, who was already preparing the video footage we had submitted as evidence. I nodded, and the prosecutor pressed play. The courtroom fell silent as the video footage from the security cameras rolled on the screen. The video, clear and undeniable, showed Karen walking onto the porch, hammer in hand, her movement purposeful. The footage continued as Karen swung. The hammer, the miss, and then the brutal impact as the hammer struck Lily's hand. The cry that followed was heart-wrenching, and I could hear it in the courtroom, even though the audio was muted. This is the moment my daughter was injured, I said, my voice still steady but heavy with emotion. I had to rush to her side to help, and I quickly took her inside to administer first aid. We later went to the hospital where medical staff treated her hand for the wound caused by the nail. I watched as the judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed. The disbelief in his eyes was palpable, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt in Karen's expression. I took a deep breath, moving forward in my testimony. Karen's actions were not an accident, I said firmly. She did not simply lose control of the hammer. The swing was deliberate. She had every intention of fixing the fence, but she also saw fit to harm my daughter in the process. There is no excuse for that. No amount of justification can erase the fact that she struck a child, my child, with no regard for her safety. I could feel Karen's gaze on me now, cold and angry. She opened her mouth to speak, but the judge cut her off with a sharp motion of his hand. Miss Dear's last name, I'll remind you that you will have your chance to present your side. Until then, please refrain from interrupting the proceedings, the judge said sternly. Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak again. Her demeanor was faltering, the once confident woman now beginning to crumble under the weight of the evidence against her. The prosecutor then called upon the medical examiner to testify. The doctor spoke briefly about the extent of Lily's injury, how the nail had punctured her skin, the swelling and bruising that followed, and the pain management that was required for her recovery. The injury had been significant enough to cause lasting damage, though it had healed with time and proper care. Karen's attorney attempted to question the doctor, trying to poke holes in the medical report. He asked if there was any way to prove intent, if there was any chance it had been a mistake. But the doctor's response was simple. The injury was caused by an intentional act. The hammer struck the hand with force. It wasn't an accident. Then it was Karen's turn to take the stand. I sat back, my mind already preparing for the lies I knew she would tell. I could see it in her eyes. She was a woman who had built her life on manipulation, and she was desperate to avoid the consequences of her actions. Karen's testimony was predictable. She claimed that the entire situation had been a misunderstanding. She said that the hammer had slipped from her hand as she was trying to fix the fence, and that she hadn't meant to hurt Lily at all. She even went so far as to claim that Lily's injury was a result of accidental clumsiness, and that I was simply overreacting. Her story was riddled with contradictions, and her eyes never met mine as she spoke. She tried to place the blame on my daughter, insinuating that Lily had somehow caused the injury. It was laughable, and I could feel my anger rising, but I kept my cool. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of back and forth, the judge called for a recess to deliberate. The tension in the courtroom was thick as everyone waited for the final decision. When the judge returned, his expression was stern. He didn't waste any time. After reviewing the evidence, including the video footage, medical records, and testimony from both sides, the court finds that Karen, last name, is guilty of assaulting Lily Harris. Her actions were deliberate and reckless. As such, she is hereby fined and prohibited from holding any future positions within the HOA. The impact of her actions on this family cannot be undone, but the law has been served. A sense of relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The victory wasn't just about the fine or the prohibition from the HOA, it was about sending a clear message. No one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could get away with harming someone, especially a child. Not on my watch. I left the courthouse with my head held high, my heart swelling with pride. The legal battle was over. But the real victory was in knowing that I had done everything possible to protect my daughter. Lily, though scarred, was resilient. She was the light in my life, and nothing, no one, could ever take that away. The hammer had tried to break her, but in the end, it had only strengthened the bond between us, and I would always be there to protect her, no matter what.